and welcome back to Snafu. My guest today is Ellen Huet. She is an award-winning investigative journalist and feature writer at Bloomberg News and Bloomberg Businessweek, where she covers technology, Silicon Valley, and the strange ways power operates inside modern business. Ellen is the author of the new book, Empire of Orgasm, Sex, Power, and the Downfall of a Wellness Cult. It's the inside account of the rise and fall of OneTaste, with which I had some personal experience early in my years in San Francisco. And she is also the host of 2 seasons of Bloomberg's narrative podcast, Foundering, one on Adam Newman of WeWork and the other on Sam Altman of OpenAI. Before Bloomberg, Ellen was a staff writer at Forbes and a crime reporter of the San Francisco Chronicle. She's spoken previously at Responsive Conference, so this is in some ways for us a part 2 after the book Empire of Orgasm comes out. Heads up, there's a little bit of background noise during the interview. She has Bart in the background, and there's some drilling that you may or may not hear, but I promise the conversation is worth it, as is her new book, Empire of Orgasm. Please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation about power, cults, sales, non-sales selling, manipulation, influence, and much, much more with my friend, investigative journalist Ellen Huet. All right, Ellen, thank you for coming on today. It's so good to see you.
So great to see you. Thanks for having me.
I've been so excited to do what is for me a part 2 of this conversation after you sitting down for an interview at Responsive Conference. I believe it was 2024.
I think so.
And actually, my history with cults writ large and OneTaste as an alleged sex cult more specifically goes back to when I first moved to San Francisco in 2007.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about your personal take on it as well when the time is right.
Yeah. Congratulations on this book, Empire of Orgasm. It's an incredible read, and you also do a great job narrating it. I don't know. In some ways, we're going to go into what OneTaste was and your specific involvement with it, and happy to go into my relationship to OneTaste as well, very peripherally, I'm fortunate to say. But in the world today, there's so much momentum for AI companies, for example, for an accelerated excitement or doomer optimism about the way the world is going that requires cultural buy-in. And so one of the things that I was struck with reading Empire of Orgasm was how similar it is to society's approach to businesses in general, and in this year of our Lord 2026 in particular, right? There is so much momentum, and not all of it is good, not all of it is positive. What's changed in your thinking about business and about work, having done this in-depth research and written and published Empire of Orgasm?
Yeah, great question. Empire, because I'm a reporter at Bloomberg. That's my full-time job. I cover tech and AI and Silicon Valley culture, and I have for, like over a decade. And then this book, Empire of Orgasm, is very much the story of a specific, sexual wellness group alleged to be a sex cult, all about the female orgasm, which we'll get to. So it's a bit of a tangent away from my regular reporting. But what's been interesting is in the process of reporting and writing the book, I've learned a lot about cults and cults. It's not a easily definable thing. We'll get into this, but I don't believe they exist on a binary. It's really a continuum of different like cult-like dynamics that can exist within relationships and within a group. So one of the broader things that it has given me is an understanding of how much social pressures and in-group norms can shape our behavior and our beliefs, and how much we are social creatures who are really wired to want to do certain actions and say certain things that we believe are going to get us status within the group that we care about, or to avoid disapproval or loss of status in the groups that we care about. So that's a really much broader idea than just what happened within this one strange group. Although the story of the strange group is a great vehicle for, I think, showing readers how powerful those forces can be. But of course, then, as in the course of my regular reporting, I have seen it come up in different ways. I've seen cult dynamics show up in different ways in business. It's really common. And especially, if you want to talk about AI, like it's especially relevant because there is so much emotionality behind some of the mission statements of these companies. Like, this idea that AI could be, the most powerful force that we have seen technologically, in a century, or the idea that it could solve all these problems. Like, yes, I think there's reasons why people are saying those, and I don't discount them. I'm not like a all the hype is overblown person. I think AI is quite powerful, and at the same time, there is this emotional element to it. Like, okay, if this is going to be a tool that can solve all these problems for humanity, then if you are some of the people building it, then you get to feel like you are like a hero, like working toward this thing that is going to reshape humanity. That's a very, very powerful belief that is really common when people join cults or other high demand groups. There is a belief often, and it can take many different forms, but there is a belief often that you have discovered something that is monumentally meaningful to humanity. You've made a special discovery. You have a sense of purpose and mission. You are a part of a small group of people who have figured something out that other people haven't figured out yet. You have a chance to like feel like you belong to this special group. And yeah, I think there's a quote from one of Sam Altman's blogs from many years ago where he says something like, "Oh, most companies." Oh gosh, I'm going to get it wrong. He basically says something like, "It's most companies are actually trying to build a religion,"
Yep.
and that overlap, I think, is something that we should all be thinking about because religions are really powerful. I think you see this in mission statements of these companies. Like I used to cover WeWork, and their mission statement was to elevate the world's consciousness. OneTaste had a mission statement of to bring orgasm, capital O, to bring capital O orgasm to 1 billion people. And of course, like these don't, these are actually pretty commonplace in terms of their grandiosity within Silicon Valley. So I think the process of reporting this book, even though it's been about a specific topic, has really opened my eyes to the ways that cult dynamics show up in so many places, business being a major one of them.
Yep. I was really struck. There's so many pieces of the book, and we'll get into lots of different sections of them, particularly where it landed for me and how you came to that. But over the couple of years that you and I've known each other, I've asked you many times, was OneTaste a sex cult? And the clearest answer I saw to that was actually towards the end of the book, where you said, actually, the binary of yes, no in answer to that question leaves off a lot of the nuance about what OneTaste did well and what OneTaste did poorly, what went horribly wrong. And I think that is a really interesting question for any organization. As somebody who's curated on the future of work since 2016, and there's some drilling going on in the background, so apologies
Yes.
for folks listening. We decided to take the opportunity to sit down with you today, even regardless of background noise. There's these things do exist on a spectrum. Every organization wants to cultivate a sense of belonging among its employees. Humans are fundamentally wired, all of us, for the approval of others, for a sense of belonging, and yet that can very well be weaponized. I had Bob Gower on stage at Responsive 2016. He's been a friend for a decade. He's the person who introduced us, talking about his experience at OneTaste. And I believe the title of that talk was The Difference Between Good Company Culture and Cults. Similarly, we had some executives from Airbnb on stage, Responsive Conference 2017 or 18, when we were in New York, talking about what Airbnb had studied and pulled from cults to build a culture of belonging, hopefully for the good, at Airbnb in that era. Right now, we assume Airbnb, it's known worldwide, but right at that time, it was really studying what it could learn to make company culture attractive to the best employees. Given the fundamental nature that we all have, and particularly the loneliness epidemic that we live in, what are some takeaways for you about, I don't know, recognizing the need to belong, but also the dangers that can come inherent in that when an organization doesn't have people's best interest at heart?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a quote at the beginning of Empire of Orgasm, which I believe it comes at the end of the prologue, so it's at the end of the first chapter, and it's from a former member, and they say something along the lines of, for those who think they would never join a group like this or never get sucked in, think again, because under the right set of social pressures, you have no idea what you would do. And to me, I really hope that people hold on to that idea and approach it with humility, because I think there is a very clear tendency among humans to be like, well, I would never, oh, that's so crazy, I would not do that. And the truth is, some people are more vulnerable to certain scenarios of social pressure than others. But I believe that it benefits all of us to remember that all of us are playing some status game one way or another, and that we are all trying to move up in some sphere that we have decided is important to us. And so for the people who were in OneTaste, what they had decided was that they wanted to move up, maintain or improve their status, or avoid disapproval. That's a really big one. Within this very structured world of OneTaste and the norms and the things that were important there. But most of us are doing that like at work, or like in a, looking for success in a certain way, or trying to build a certain life. And it's not all, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Like the reason that, humans as social creatures, like, are an incredible force. Like, that is how we coordinate. That is how we make movements. That is how we, like, feel part of something. And so, but it is interesting to me to remember that, within OneTaste, for example, it was like, one of the ways that you gained status was if you were a really high performing salesperson and you sold a lot of these expensive seminars to other students, to other customers. And sometimes there was, people have told me about times that they felt pressured to sell to people who they knew could not afford them, like people who they knew were going to be taking on debt in order to buy these courses.
Yeah, you tell stories of people saying like,
people being
"That's fine.
encouraged
I'll walk you
to,
through getting a credit card. Here's how to
yeah,
put money on
taking
your."
out new credit cards, bankruptcy, like things that are, financially unhealthy in order to take on these courses. And there were other pressures too, like you would be pressured to, many people talk to me about being pressured to do the main practice of OneTaste, which was orgasmic meditation. Again, we'll get into it, but do the orgasmic meditation practice with potential customers, because they really wanted to sign those customers up for courses. So it was really actually putting their bodies on the line in a very sexual and intimate way in order to advance the business of the company. And again, it's easy to be like, I would never do that. That's just, well, you've probably chosen a different structure to
Well,
advance in. And
yeah, I'll share very personally. So I moved to San Francisco in 2008, fresh out of college, thinking I was, hot shit, and started working restaurants and was incredibly lonely. Didn't date for a year. Didn't have a lot of a social life. Felt very isolated. I had dislocated my cervical spine on a trampoline, so I was in a lot of chronic pain, needing to figure out how to recover. Met a woman who specializes in rehab, in what my wife now calls voodoo, right? That helped me a lot. But I was lying on my back on the floor among 80 parents of kids with special needs. That's really who she specialized with, doing weird somatic stuff. And my parents would sit me down and be like, "We think you're part of a cult. Like, this is really concerning to us. You don't have friends your age. You're going to this weird woman's seminars that were exactly as you described, very expensive for years. And we don't understand it. You have your own language around it, right?" I would say it had cult adjacent tendencies. I would not qualify it as a cult, but oftentimes people who are inside of an organization that has cult-like tendencies don't consider it a cult. Um, I then went on to study at an organization on the East Coast that was even more, had cult like tendencies, had been founded in the 70s, had an in group, was expensive, had courses that we would take that were a week long, that were completely removed from the rest of the world and the rest of society. Um, I look at who I am today and I'm very grateful for those experiences. They taught me super valuable skills that have shaped my career ever since. But the people who were looking in from the outside were definitely concerned. And there is a sense of belonging, there is a sense of tribalism. Um, I was a young man, I was vulnerable. I was specifically looking to rehabilitate, and I had tried talking to dozens of doctors and PT and massage and everything under the sun, and found this one very specialized form of somatic movement that did help and did ultimately cure or resolve my chronic injury, right? But like, there, but for the grace of God, that could have been Nicole Dedon.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it illustrates something that I feel very strongly, which is, people also assume that people who join high demand groups or cults are like unintelligent or missing in some sort of wisdom or like logical facility. And I really reject that. I think that it is much more about a match between what a group promises and offers and what you are really, really seeking. Like your story makes so much sense because you had looked in so many places for, you know, doctors and physical therapists and whoever about trying to heal some aspect of your body. And like if you have that yearning and then someone offers something, and especially if it kind of works, then you're like, okay, like I need to, like it feels much more attractive, and it also feels scarier to leave behind because you probably, like if this group had been a group that then was like, okay, you need to pay more money for like more acting, if there was escalating demands on your energy and resources, which is really common in cults, then it would have been harder for you to step away.
Yeah.
And similarly with OneTaste, what they were promising through orgasmic meditation was something that a lot of people yearn for and have trouble finding elsewhere, which is this promise of better relationships, better understanding of your sex life, like a healing, a sexual healing, basically. And so people who came and sought out OneTaste or were particularly drawn to it are people who were looking for that. Like maybe they had just been through a divorce, maybe they had always struggled to find connection in their romantic and sexual relationships, maybe they struggled with performance anxiety during sex or sexual performance, maybe they had sexual trauma in their background. Like these are really common, and people also don't talk about them that much, so it makes
Yeah.
sense that people were drawn to OneTaste regardless of how smart or well supported or whatever they were. Like there were people from all walks of life ended up here because they were particularly yearning for healing in this area. And I think that that is much more important than sort of what people think makes someone join a cult.
Yep. Let's get into what oming was. I was fascinated. I knew much about One Taste in the era that I lived in San Francisco, which was 2008 to 2018 or so.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know Nicole's backstory and what led her to start One Taste to begin with. So if you're willing to share a little bit about that, and then what the practice was, which actually, funnily enough, I came to learn about through Tim Ferriss's The 4 Hour Body.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, give a little bit of the
Of
background for
course.
who Nicole
Yeah.
was and her world.
And yeah, Tim Ferriss was kind of a pivotal, like, endorser of the practice early on, but we'll get to that. So Nicole Daedone, the founder of OneTaste, grew up in the Bay Area in the 70s. She was originally from Los Gatos, and in her late 20s, she meets a guy who introduces her to a clitoral stroking practice, and it is it is her first experience of this practice that she will eventually shape into orgasmic meditation, which will then become the core practice of her company. And the way that she learns about this practice is by studying, through this guide, he introduces her to these groups that already exist in the Bay Area that teach a practice called deliberate orgasm, which is essentially a meditative clitoral stroking practice focused on the female orgasm that is sort of this quasi-spiritual thing. And so there are these two groups. One of them is called Morehouse. The other one is called the Welcomed Consensus. One of them is a spin-off of the other. So they're both related. And one of them was started in Lafayette. The other one had space in San Francisco, but also up north toward Oregon. And they're both run by men. And they're both a little like... They're a little bit more like old school. Like they have like a compound far away and very much like a clear leader. And Nicole comes in, she spends some time with them, she learns about the practice, she observes how these groups run, and eventually decides she wants to start her own version with her as the leader. And this is in the early 2000s in San Francisco. And she decides to call it OneTaste, and she decides to rebrand the practice as orgasmic meditation, OM, also using the abbreviation OM. So you'll hear people talk about doing an OM or OMing together. And there's just a few things to note about this that I think were pretty savvy at the time. One is that this is a practice about the female orgasm. It makes sense for it to be run by a woman, and so I think that was a smart move on her part. To rebrand the practice as orgasmic meditation, very smart. All of a sudden it's spiritual, it's a practice, it kind of loses some of this prurient concern, and it's a little bit more like elevated. And then of course OM as the abbreviation, it's like, yeah, people are hearing OM every day in their yoga classes. It's like, it's really well timed for the trends of the moment, which are like kind of this secular spiritual pursuit of wellness. The wellness industry is just starting to take off in the mid to late 2000s. The startup boom is really starting to crank up in San Francisco in the 2000s, and all of a sudden Nicole is like, yeah, female founder, like running this wellness startup. It's very smart of her to do some of those business choices. And unlike her predecessors, she chose to try to spread the gospel of OM by making it a business, making it a startup. And again, that's kind of the beginning of what we see, this larger pattern in and around San Francisco in that era, in which the best way to spread a message was by building a company, right? And I think we see that happen a lot over the course of the next 15 to 20 years.
I was going to say, might still be true.
Totally. I think it still is true. I think that's a really strong belief in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley, is that like the best and most effective method to like proselytize something is actually by building a very successful high growth company about it.
Yeah.
And so orgasmic meditation, which is the central practice of OneTaste and the thing that they sell courses about, is essentially a 15-minute partnered, mindful, meditative clitoral stroking practice in which there's a strokee, usually a woman, who gets naked from the waist down and lies down on the ground, and a stroker, usually a man, who puts on a glove on his left hand and lube on his left index finger. And for 15 minutes, he strokes the clitoris of the woman in a very prescribed manner, and at the only goal for both parties.
I haven't gone back, but I should look at 4 Hour Body. You didn't talk about it in Empire of Orgasm. Wasn't it like clockwise or counterclockwise? Wasn't there something that was
yes, there's
directionally specific?
Sometimes they would specify that the best spot of the clitoris to stroke was
upper right quadrant.
It depends on whose point of view you're looking at. They would say it would be 1 o'clock on the clock face if you were facing the vulva. So so it would be, and so the man would be using his left finger. Yeah.
Just to interject for a second, like on the one hand, the prurience, the like, this is a group of people stroking each other, it's super gendered, like there's so many pieces about it. And then on the other, this idea, which shouldn't be revolutionary in the world, but is, of like, what if sexual desire could be, not necessarily timed, but without outcome? What if it was not, the specificity of like, you know, a gender dichotomy where the goal is an orgasm and then we are done, right? Which is like sex is unexamined. Esther Perel
Yes.
and everybody else who talks about, sex as a practice perhaps and not right, like there is truth there, and something
There
that you
are
spoke about really elegantly in Empire is there are truths underneath every cult that that have value. Otherwise, why would people join in the first place?
100%.
And if we
So
lose
I
track of the taking advantage of people, you can just focus on that value, and that's perhaps how people get sucked in.
Yeah, I think there are two things about orgasmic meditation, the practice, that I find really commendable and that I, you know, wish that people would think about more in their sex lives, no matter what practice you're doing or however you're relating to other people sexually. The first is goallessness. It's this idea that within an orgasmic meditation session, for those 15 minutes, the only goal, as stated, was for both parties to meditate on the sensations in their body. And that is kind of a radical idea. Like so many times we go into sex with this goal of like, well, I want, it's not a success unless we achieve XYZ or whatever. And frankly, there's a lot of people for whom that pressure is overwhelming, or it really, even Nicole said something like, the what we think of as climax can hold hostage the whole rest of the sexual act. I do agree with that. I think this idea of goallessness is both important and valuable, and something that a lot of people were drawn to. So again, if you are one of the estimated 10 to 15% of American women who struggle to have an orgasm, that might be a huge weight off your chest. It's like it's 15 minutes. Whatever happens, you're just there to be with the sensations and enjoy it. And then that's very similar to sitting meditation. It's like, yeah, you're just noticing. And same for people who might struggle with performance anxiety of any kind during sex. So the goallessness was really valuable. And then the other part was this explicit non-reciprocity, this idea that women under this framework and this practice would receive pleasurable sexual touch from a partner and explicitly not owe him anything, not sex, a phone number, a hug, whatever. And again, like for some people that might be uncomfortable or pushing boundaries. Like within OneTaste, there was definitely the norm that you would do the OM practice with people that you didn't know personally, you didn't have a relationship with. That's really confronting for a lot of people. But the non-reciprocity is a really interesting and provocative idea, something that I think you could go your whole life not imagining. Like we are really
Yep.
conditioned to imagine that if someone gives you um, sexual attention, that you owe them something really important in return, usually sexual attention or something like that. And so for a lot of women, these two and men, these two aspects of it were pretty revelatory. And I talked to people who described to me doing their first few OM sessions and crying because they were just experiencing this type of touch in a setting that was completely different from what they had experienced in their life before. So in no way do I want to discount those values of it. And in fact, I think that does help expand our compassion for why people join these groups. It's like, yeah, there was a good idea here. Like, and in no way do I think that means that like harm didn't happen. You know what I mean? It's like we can hold these two things simultaneously. Um, and if anything, I want readers of Empire of Orgasm to walk away with a greater compassion for why people make these choices, why people join
Mm-hmm.
groups like this, why they stay. And I think part of it is understanding what is so valuable about some of the central practices. So yeah, Nicole takes orgasmic meditation, she brands it as this thing, and it becomes this like wellness hack. and and that's where people like Tim Ferriss come in, in the it would have been like 2009, 2010, when he writes the 4 Hour Body, and it's his big follow up to the 4 Hour Work Week. And he dedicates, I think, one, maybe even two full chapters to this stroking practice and to talking about orgasmic meditation. And his conclusion is something like this should be required education for every man on the planet. And that's such a strong endorsement. And OneTaste will go on to use that for many, many years. And it leads to other endorsements like from Gwyneth Paltrow. Like Gwyneth Paltrow has Nicole come and speak on her on stage at the Goop Health Conference, interviews her on the Goop podcast. Even Khloe Kardashian weighs in and says that she recommends Nicole's book and talks about how great orgasmic meditation is. So you end up in the 2010s getting the stamps of approval from some really big names and big influencers and big celebrities in wellness.
I was interested to see also OneTaste and Nicole Chase specific people for those endorsements. So I had the pleasure of knowing Tony Hsieh. He attended Responsive Conference 2016, and then we were hosted at Zappos HQ in 2019. But in between those, when I was opening up Robin's Cafe, he actually brought me out to downtown Las Vegas and invited me to open up a Robin's Cafe too in the downtown project. And I've always been grateful that I didn't do that because, and I mean, he was maybe an acquaintance. Several close friends were very close, were, worked with him for years, etc. But I watched small businesses like My Little Cafe that tried to open up projects in the downtown project, and they were, love bombed at first to take a cold word of like, welcome, this is going to be so exciting. And they were often funded. And then they were left to make it or not make it. And a lot of those projects really struggled in downtown Las Vegas. And so right, yet another place that for me reading Empire really landed was this idea of love bombing, this idea of like, congratulations, you're here, right? And I mean, Tony did an amazing job. He was, in my opinion, a good human, deeply troubled, rest in peace. But like, there were these pieces of I was in awe. I'd had a Zappos culture book on my bookshelf for a decade, and here is Tony Hsieh showing me around downtown Las Vegas. And then to know that in that same era, Nicole was pursuing Tony to try to get a similar endorsement, because if OneTaste is endorsed by the famous Tony Hsieh, that will add to their credibility and expand their reach.
Yeah. Yeah, they pursued, they even set up basically a satellite office in Las Vegas for about a year with the unspoken but clearly understood intent among their employees to try to woo Tony Hsieh. And there's even a OneTaste employee who was basically tasked with trying to like win him over, whatever it took. And they also tried to pursue partnerships with like Tony Robbins, and so they were also pursuing people in the personal transformation, these big life changing seminars space, which was also a booming business in that same era.
Jumping around a little bit, but something you talked about and I didn't know before reading the book was the extent to which OneTaste was a super sales heavy organization, and sales in the worst way. I just finished running this one-day conference in March, just about a month ago, called Snafu, on maybe Dan Pink's idea of non-sales selling, right? Of sales for non-salespeople, or persuasion without force is another way that I've come to think about it. And I was struck by the extent to which OneTaste had a sales machine that was extraordinarily pushy. The prices were constantly increasing on the next great thing that they had just rolled out. Tell us, folks listening and watching, a little bit about the sales side of OneTaste.
Yeah, sales was the main revenue driver for OneTaste, and the way that it often worked is that OneTaste employees, if you started taking classes at OneTaste and then you became more involved in the community, what that often looked like is you would leave your old job and join the OneTaste sales team and start working for OneTaste. You would leave your old home and move into a communal house that might be formally or informally run by OneTaste or OneTaste staff, and gradually start to spend all your time immersed in this world. So all these people would become your coworkers, your roommates, your lovers, your managers, all these things. And the way that the sales team would work is they were just constantly selling expensive courses. So, it might, if you were a new student, it might be a weekend course that costs several $100s. That's like the introduction to Om, or learning the basic principles of Om. But it could quickly turn into $500 for like a longer course, or several $1,000s for like a week-long immersion. Or toward the peak, it would, people paid up to, $36,000 for a 2-week intensive with Nicole Daedone. And you could also pay close to $60,000 to be a member for a year, which meant that you could take any course you wanted and sit in the front row and have special access to Nicole, or you could pay for 3 years of membership all at once, which they called lineage. Anyway, you can imagine like there was often this pressure to keep buying the next thing. Oh, and then they also offered something called the coaching program, which could cost up to $20,000, a multi-month program similar to yoga teacher training, where you are ostensibly being taught how to start your own coaching business, but often it was just a way to get people to become more like deeply devoted to the practice. And within the coaching program, they would teach you how to sell courses to other people. And there's actually a scene in the book that comes from a video recording of Rachel Cherwitz, who was like Nicole's second in command. And she was often the head of sales. She was the head of sales for many years at OneTaste. And there's a video of her teaching coaching program students how to sell. And they're walking through this like selling protocol, which I gather is not unique to OneTaste, but it is deployed, pretty strongly within the company. This idea of you find a customer, you find what their pain point is, you take them there, then you expand upon it, then you offer like just as they're really feeling the pain of potentially being lonely and disconnected their whole life, then you're like, would you like to buy the thing that is going to solve that? And that is a OneTaste course. And so, there were also like many people who, again, talked about being pressured to take on debt in order to buy these courses. There were people who would like fundraise on Indiegogo and other like GoFundMe sites to try to get money to pay for courses. And there was really a sense of scarcity. Like it was often like, oh, if you don't take this class, like you're kind of going to be left behind in your spiritual growth, or this, I think where people often felt very uneasy or often predatory sales practices was around the emotional manipulation that went behind it. So many people talked to me about feeling like, oh, the OneTaste staff were so friendly to me until I said I didn't want to buy the course, and then they completely ignored me, or, that they would feel, shunned socially or shamed for not taking these courses. Or it went even farther. People described to me being told, money is just energy, and like if you don't have the money for it, that means that it means that you just need to overcome this energetic block. Or if you're afraid of spending that much money, it means that actually you're very close to some sort of breakthrough. They also had a lot of cultural norms around people asking each other to pay for courses, and that could quickly get tangled up in dynamics of like, maybe someone joins OneTaste and they don't have that much sexual leverage in their life, but they have a lot of cash. And then there's someone who doesn't have a lot of cash, but is young and hot and sexy. And then the staff would maybe encourage one of them to ask the other one for money to pay for a course. So it got really tangled up within, it was like this really nuts and bolts thing that the company needed, which was to bring in revenue. And then it very quickly got tangled up in some of their philosophies again around like, if you're afraid to spend the money, then that means you're like about to break through some sort of conditioning, and it's going to be really good for you, and really pressuring people to think of money as not real. And so there are people who described also starting to get into debt, and they're like, well, $3,000, $30,000, it's all kind of the same thing, right? Because like energy, money is just energy. So yeah, it's
Fun.
interesting to see the way that the sales culture was influenced both by an actual need to make money, and then colored by a little bit more like spiritual teachings of the company.
In the course of this conversation, and more than I was expecting, there's a like, oh, it's clearly bad. Oh, that's so aspirational. Oh, that's clearly bad again. We just hit a new maybe low of like, oh my God, that sounds god awful, right? Like, and the the conviction, the ultimate outcome, of course, which we'll get into. But Nicole was prosecuted by the FBI, and yet, just to draw it back into more neutral again, I've been writing a newsletter for the last 3 years on influence and persuasion, particularly what is what is influence without force? What is inviting without, the sleazy car salesman, buy this car at all costs, right? And increasingly in my career, I've discovered that actually everything is sales or non-sale selling. That inviting you onto this podcast, asking my wife to marry me, right? Trying to train my dog, it's all a form of sales, but it's done at its best so gently and with such a clear win-win. And yet sales has a stigma for exactly the reasons that you're describing of the used car salesman, of the telemarketer who's called me 3 times during this podcast. What, I don't know, I've never asked you this question. I guess what is sales to you? What is the truth there? And then of course where we're going to go to it is like, how do you tell the difference between healthy influence and persuasion that is based on connection and mutual benefit, and the worst examples of taking advantage of another people for your own?
Yeah, it is honestly really hard to answer that question. I thought a lot about it as well. And there were some ideas that would come up within the sales culture of OneTaste that I'm sure would resonate with you as like a good idea. Like I think Rachel Cherwitz, again, the head of sales, this woman who was Nicole's right hand woman and kind of her enforcer, she would often be the one coming in and like really pounding the table about sales, whereas it allowed Nicole to float up higher as the untouchable guru, the one who just descends every once in a while to dispense wisdom, that kind of thing. It's a very important co-leader dynamic that you'll see echoed in other groups, kind of like the guru and then the enforcer. But Rachel, would say things like, in sales, people are going to hear you, but they're really going to feel you. So it's more about like you need to show up with the right energy when you are making an ask to somebody, because if you're feeling like constricted and tight about feeling bad about asking for something, people are going to sense it. Guess what? I think she's right. Like
Super
there's
true.
a lot about how you show up to someone. Even as a journalist, I am often, a big part of my job is asking people to do things for me, like share information that might be risky for them to share, or to give me some of their time to try to explain something complicated. Often there's an understanding of what they might stand to benefit from it as well, but I'm making a lot of asks, and so like I do understand that the energy with which you make an ask is an important thing. So like she's right about that. And then she would also, so interesting, people who had been on the sales team at OneTaste described to me believing so strongly in what they were selling. They would say things, they would tell me that at the time they believed that they were selling, if they approached a client who was like unsure about taking the course, they would sometimes have the attitude like, it is my job as the person on sales at OneTaste to guide them to their awakening. And their awakening is, they believed at the time, contained within taking this next course, right? Like if you take this course, it's going to like be really good for your personal growth.
Yep.
And so if the person showed resistance, they sometimes had the attitude that they knew better, and they were like, oh, it's our job to kind of get them to say yes because we know that it's going to be good for
And
them.
if you
And
believe
so
that, you're proselytizing, right? Like that's, a missionary.
totally. And I think missionary is a great analogy for what a lot of the salespeople felt like at OneTaste. They felt like they had discovered this revelatory idea of bringing like capital O orgasm, which by the way, they redefined orgasm within OneTaste to mean sort of like broader erotic energy. It was very similar to the Force in Star Wars, something that could give you guidance, something that you could tap into for extra energy and vitality. And so what we would think of as an orgasm, they were like, that's just climax. Like orgasm is this bigger thing. So anyway, that's what they talk about when they say we want to bring orgasm to 1 billion people. So they would believe that they were doing it for the person's good, and that they knew better than the customer, what really was good for them. They needed to like wake them up to their desire. And so they really felt like empowered, meaningful, benevolent, purpose driven. Like it's it's a very powerful like frame of mind to have instilled in their salespeople. I think where it gets dicey, obviously, is if they believe that they know better than the person about what, what is good for them. Like maybe that's one possible red flag for where sales can go from good to like really dangerous, is like total dismissal of like the customer's sovereignty and their understanding of themselves. But I think what makes this tricky is like it's hard to know exactly. There's not a really obvious line. Like you could draw some other lines like, yeah, I don't think people should take on debt or feel pressured to take on debt to buy these courses. But, within OneTaste, that was something that they thought was acceptable, I think, because they believed it was in pursuit of this greater goal of personal growth and spiritual and sexual liberation. But they would speak about sales in this very grandiose way. It, sort of like one person recalled Rachel saying things like, "Oh, sales is love, and the universe is made of sales, and therefore, I don't know, the universe is made of love," or what? I got that wrong, but basically, like equating sales with this very ultra meaningful way. They made it like a spiritual pursuit, basically, and they would, what was strange was they would also tie it, your sales performance as a salesperson at OneTaste was often tied back to your the state of your orgasmic awakening. So there were also salespeople who were then told things like, if they were not hitting their targets, someone on the sales team might tell them, "Oh, your orgasm seems really blocked up. That's why you're not making sales." And then they would often assign or direct these salespeople to go off and, have sex with another sales worker in order to like unblock their orgasm so that they could come back and sell better. So like that at that point that starts to veer off, I think, from what we would normally think of as like a healthy and inspired sales force. But again, one of those interesting examples where this very earthly pursuit of money was mixed with this, these spiritual beliefs around how your erotic energy might affect other parts of your work performance.
Yep. I think a lot about the difference between influence and persuasion. Influence, like in the best ways. I'll give an example very concretely from my life. My dad had chronic back pain for a decade as a result of a lifetime as a runner. Had a small surgery that really solved that, but he had in that 10 years stopped going to the gym. And so in 2020 or 2021, I managed to persuade him, invite him to start going back to the gym. And he's been going to the gym 5 days a week since. Got a sauna. I gave him a rower, and it in his words, changed his life substantially in healthy ways. He's given me permission to share that story. And that's influence, that's persuasion, but it's through connection and the consent of all parties. Then there's manipulation, right? Which maybe is working against the best interest of the other person. But it gets complicated when I believe as a salesperson that I know better. And I mean, I think that's one of my red flags. So my question for you is, what are the red flags that draw the line between connected influence and persuasion, or sales without force, and taking advantage of people? Because the lines, at least to me, I hope that I will always have them clear. And I think at this point in my life I will. But I worry about if I have a son at 19 who moves to the big city, and right, like I feel for my parents for who I was then, lonely and alone and looking for answers. And I don't know how to teach those guidelines. And so maybe what are some of the boundaries that you might draw between, healthy influence and manipulation and coercion?
Yeah, in the criminal trial that ended up happening, Nicole and Rachel were eventually charged with a federal crime, and there was a criminal trial last summer in New York. And one of the witnesses got on the stand and said something that really stuck with me. He said that one way to think about consent and undue influence is to remember that if someone cannot freely say no, then they cannot freely say yes. So even if they are saying yes in a scenario where, even if they are saying yes, if it's in a scenario where the consequences of saying no are such that it doesn't feel like a viable option, then it's
Mm-hmm.
not a yes. And I think that that captured something very real for me, just in my personal opinion about where these things can go wrong. There was often at OneTaste so many negative consequences associated with saying no. It could be feeling shamed, like if there were women who were directed to with a potential customer and they said no, they were sometimes shamed for being resistant, which was a very bad thing, or having a, excuse my language, a golden pussy that they were like too, thought it was too good for people to touch, like. And these things, they might sound silly, but they really matter if this world is your whole world, right? Like your social approval and your sense of belonging within this group. If it becomes threatened, that is really scary. And people describe to me feeling like, or being told that they were on a spiritual path to enlightenment, and that if they left this path, again by going against the directives or teachings of the group, that they would never find enlightenment anywhere else, that they would be spiritually ruined and forever seeking some sort of fulfillment that they could never have. That's terrifying, like, especially if you are someone for whom seeking spiritual fulfillment is a major part of your life. And so people described feeling this fear that if they left the path of OneTaste, um, by saying no to some of the things that they were being directed or asked to do, that they would be spiritually screwed. And so again, it's like they might have said yes, but under this framework, if there was not a free and open path for you to say no, then it's not really a yes. And I think that's where it starts to get harmful. And again, you could apply that to sales, where it's like you can imagine a sales pitch where like you are really bringing all of your persuasion to the table and you're saying like this is how much I think this will be really good for you, and I hope you can trust me because of all the things that we've done before and all this. And that can be fine. And I think as long as you really honestly convey, and it is honestly true, that it's okay to say no, like that seems much healthier to me than the alternative where it is a very fear-based type of, I think it's fair to say, manipulation. Like if you are really pulling on someone's fear responses to get them to do something, like it just doesn't sit right with me. And what's interesting about this question is it's up for debate. People who have done more sales than I have might have different opinions, or the continuum of influence. Even people who study cults talk about influence existing on a continuum. So there's clearly
Mm-hmm.
no hard and fast yes or no binary about like what's harmful or what's not. And again, that actually brings us back to this bigger question of why do people want to have a clear answer on whether a group is a cult or not? I think it's because they want a shorthand for, is it dangerous or is it not? And guess what? Like, danger is also not a yes or no question. A cult is not a yes or no question. It is um, a series of cultish dynamics that exist on this spectrum. And you might have a group that has, 17 out of 20 and a group that has 3 out of 20. And it is more realistic and helpful if you understand what the dynamics are and can recognize which ones are present and which ones are not, than to try to force it into a yes or no question.
Something else that I've experienced, a different domain in my life, is I've had a couple of incredible athletic coaches and teachers over the last 2 decades, both as a professional acrobat and since. And watching the group that studied with the leader adopt physical mannerisms, shared language, even so much as like everyone wears the same pants or everyone has the same haircut. It was really interesting and unexpected to watch within OneTaste through the book. First, monogamy was frowned on, and then there was a period, and sexual roles were super gendered, right? Very just straight hetero relationships. And then there was a period where monogamy was the next to godliness, and there were a lot of marriages within
Yeah.
OneTaste, and everyone followed Nicole's, not necessarily what she did, but what she dictated was the the
What
path.
she approved of, what she was clearly approving of at the time. Yeah.
And I look at, I mean, one of my teachers, we all wore the same pants for like several
Mm-hmm.
years.
Yeah.
And it's just, there were no other elements of cult like behavior perhaps within that other than we all wore the same pants. But you walk into that weird group of people doing this very specific type of movement practice, this acrobatic practice, and it's like, huh, everyone here looks the same. What's going on here? It was fascinating and unexpected.
Yeah, cults are really effective at changing people's behavior. So that can be deployed for good or harmful outcomes, and maybe even neutral ones, like wearing the same pants. It's not the end of the world if you all wear the same pants, but it is fascinating again how much you have to imagine within that really specific social sphere of being part of that movement practice or being taught by someone who is clearly the charismatic leader of that group. Again, how much people are drawn to actions, whether like trivial or big, obvious or not, actions that are going to get them social approval and belonging within the group, or specifically from the leader, approval from the leader, or to avoid disapproval. And the other thing that I learned in the process of reporting this book that has really stuck with me is a line from a different, book written decades earlier about cults, from Margaret Singer. She's a cult researcher and expert, and she said, "We do not need to be told what the rules are. We can look around and infer, like in an unspoken way, what we should or should not do." And that really stuck with me too, because one of the ways that Nicole conveyed what she wanted people to do, she was never so like crude as to be like, I command you to do this. It's like, well, that would probably turn people off and it would be seen as a bit like blunt or heavy handed. Instead, what's a lot more effective is like you're lecturing to a group of people, and Nicole would do this all the time. And she really wanted person A to do a certain action. And she knew that they like were hesitant or something. But person B, who was considered like a peer or maybe a rival of person A, had done the action. And so then she would just praise and praise person B for having done that thing. And guess what person A feels? They feel really called out by that. And she has not said a word. She has never said to person A, you got to do this thing or you're going to be rejected. Like, and in some ways it's much more powerful even then for person A to think like, wow, I guess I really do want to do this thing. Like, I'm feeling really emotional about the fact that like that this dynamic is coming up, and so it really struck me how the implicit messages that we get about what to do and what not to do can be more powerful than the explicit ones. And then in a setting like a criminal trial or a jury, courtroom, it is just harder to say like, yeah, well, maybe I was never like commanded to do these things, but the explicit expectation, if we expect there to be like explicit commands, then it undercuts the actual power of what's going on between humans, which is that like implicit commands
Is
are
everything.
quite strong. They're very, very strong. And it just again gave me a lot of humility about like what makes us do things. Like it's not it just doesn't often look like we imagine, like, yeah, you're locked in a room or someone's telling you you have to do this thing. It's really not like that. And a more accurate and realistic reflection of human social pressure and where it can go wrong is an understanding that it's often unsaid.
Yep. What are the characteristics of cults? You list them out so eloquently in the book. What are the sort of most common characteristic traits?
Yeah, I don't pretend to have a comprehensive list, and of course, different experts disagree on this, but I think there are some basic ones that I feel like come up again and again. And you don't have to have all of these for it to be a high demand group or a group that extracts and exploits people. But the more of them, the more you should be concerned. The charismatic leader, it's a cliche for a reason. That is often there, although not always. Someone who really presents themselves as having special or divine knowledge that they can, bestow upon you if you follow them and do, what they say. Um, if there's an ideology to the group that purports to answer the biggest questions in life. Some, an ideology that doesn't just answer like one area, it doesn't just solve one area of your life, but can be really expansive. So again, within OneTaste, they would often start out with the claims that orgasmic meditation would help with your sex life and your relationships. But if you get deeper, it's also like it's curing your autoimmune diseases, your chronic illnesses, your vitality, your fatigue, things that get quite broad. Then what else? Like an idea that outsiders don't understand us. There's a sense of like information control, the idea that like you should really trust information that comes from within the group and discount information that comes from outside. Another really common one that I find fascinating is the use of language within cults and groups like this. Like if there is very specialized in-group language, not only does that serve to heighten the bonds within the group, like all of a sudden if you are new to the group and you start to understand how to speak in the jargon of the group, you feel like you belong. And guess what? It also separates you from the relationships that you have outside in this subtle way where you're like, you're using all this language and your friends from high school don't understand. They're like, what is Robin talking about? Like, that doesn't make any sense, and then you're just like, oh, they don't get it. And it can really serve to separate in-group and out-group. And again, just overall having that sense of in-group, out-group separation is a big part of what draws people in and keeps them in. Another common one that people talk about for a good reason is this sense of explicit or again implicit separation of you from your previous relationships, from your sources of support that exist outside of the group. So within OneTaste, it was sometimes explicit, like people have talked to me about leaders within the group giving them a really hard time about taking time away from OneTaste to go visit their family, or they would ask them questions like, well, how are you going to stay awake? How are you going to not fall asleep when you go visit your family? They would talk about people on the outside as muggles or dead, especially if they had been part of OneTaste and left. Like there was a big sense that those people had like lost their way and were not to be spoken to, or not to be you were really supposed to keep up relationships with them. But there's also this implicit stuff where it's like, yeah, the more time you spend with your orgasmically inclined new friends, roommates, housemates, lovers, then the less time, your friends just don't really get it anymore, and so you don't spend time with them. So yeah, anything that separates you from the outside world. And then yeah, like behavior change. There's a whole section in one of the kind of like cult frameworks about like behavior control, and that again can be explicit or implicit. And then a big one is also like, and again, not necessary, but shows up pretty often, is like, does the group control your sexual relationships? And that can look like prescribed celibacy, or prescribed like having sex with a lot of people, like that happened at OneTaste, or arranging partnerships that also happened at OneTaste. There were often strong recommendations from leaders, Nicole and others, about which couples, if you entered as a couple within OneTaste, often people were pressured to break up in order to like expand their sexuality, or they might be subtly pressured to pair up in different ways. Again, the whole monogamy was very frowned upon in OneTaste for many years, and then all of a sudden in like 2014, 2015, it became this like cool thing to do, and a bunch of people got married. And any group that really puts pressure on who you are having sex with, why, and when, is likely to have a deeper sense of control over you, because your sex life is one of the most intimate things about you. And so if a group has managed to get to a place where it can tell you what to do in that arena, like that's usually a sign that there's a lot of control going on.
Yeah. Going a little bit broader, you've narrated and reported 2 different seasons of Bloomberg's podcast Foundering, one about Adam Neumann, the founder of WeWork, one about Sam Altman. We've seen a lot about Sam Altman in the news. I don't know. First, maybe I'm fascinated by comeback stories, right? And we've seen some comeback stories. Travis Kalanick has been in the news a lot lately with his new company after his sort of ouster from Uber. I've been surprised, actually, sort of having lost track of Adam Neumann and then seeing him reappear and get a lot of investment and running a company. How do you feel when, as a reporter who, I mean, I think I'm not a journalist, I'm not a reporter, right? But like you can't but grow attached or at least interested in these outcomes, right? Watching Nicole's prosecution, right? I was wondering 5 years ago, was she going to get prosecuted? Was she going to make a comeback? Was Ohm going to come back to San Francisco? Right? That was a conversation I was having with people I knew who had been affected by the ecosystem. I don't know. What is your thought about comeback stories first? And why they're popular? Why, I mean, Steve Jobs came back to Apple and is heralded ever since. I mean, it goes in
Yeah.
both directions.
Yeah, I think, look, there's just something about our human wiring. We like to have stories where there is a main character, and someone, it's much more compelling for our brains to latch on to a rise and fall if it is tied to a person rather than an idea. And I think this is why you end up with like cycles where people are sort of holding up this person as like the harbinger of something amazing, and then as soon as their fortunes start to turn, then all of a sudden it's also like we love to see them fall. um you know, and then therefore sometimes a comeback is also a compelling story. Like there, I think there's, I remember reading somewhere that there's really only like 5 to 7 story arcs out there, and you can really,
Yeah.
one of them is rags to riches, one of them is rise and fall. You get the idea. There's a lot of there's a lot that our brains are just drawn to specifically. Like we like to see those stories, and they can look a million different ways, but at their heart, they're charting the same dynamic. And when it came to Nicole, you're totally right. Also, that as a journalist, like, yeah, if you spend a lot of time reporting on a company or a person, like you are dedicating time and energy to trying to understand this person. So I have done that with Adam Newman and with Sam Alden and with Nicole Dayton. And I think when it came to reporting on OneTaste, the basic overview is, by the way, that I was pitched a story on OneTaste back in 2017 where they were like, "Oh, you write about startups? Like, we're a fast-growing woman-led wellness startup. Maybe you want to write about us." I started doing some reporting. I ended up getting in touch with someone who had had a really bad experience at OneTaste. They connected me to other people. I found other people on my own. And then all of a sudden it became clear that this story was really going to be about cult allegations at this company. And it was this big investigative piece that came out in 2018. And at the time, I was
The
not at
lesson
all
there
thinking
is
about,
be careful what you pitch journalists to
yeah.
learn about.
Yeah, it's not common. That's not like a common path, but it did happen that way. And at the time that I wrote that story, I was not at all thinking about, is this a crime? I wouldn't even know like where to start with that. But what happened is several months after that story came out, I started to hear from sources that FBI agents were investigating OneTaste. They were showing up at their door, asking them a bunch of questions about their time there. And it was unclear what might come of it. It was unclear if that, the FBI investigates a lot of stuff. It doesn't always lead to an indictment or criminal charges against anyone involved in that group. So the FBI investigation actually went on for many years, 5 years. In parallel, I was making this decision to start to write this book. I was starting to do more reporting for the book. I was writing my first draft, all these things. And I was never looking, I was always looking at it with the lens of like, what is interesting about this group from a narrative journalist's point of view, and not so much about like, I just didn't, it's not my job to decide if that's a crime or not. And meanwhile, in 2023, federal prosecutors unsealed their indictment against Nicole and against Rachel. And so both of these women were charged with a federal crime. The crime is forced labor conspiracy. And we'll get into the details, but that's the specific one. And then that kicked off 2 years of pre-trial, like motions and hearings and all that stuff that leads up to a potential trial. And then there was a criminal trial in Brooklyn in summer 2025, which lasted about 5 or 6 weeks and ended with a jury convicting both Rachel and Nicole of this federal crime. And the next day, the two women were actually had their bail revoked and were taken into federal custody. And then they were just
The
sentenced
sentencing
at
was
the end
just
of
a
March.
couple of weeks
Yeah,
ago.
very recently. So Nicole was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, and Rachel to 6.5. As well as Nicole was also given like a or like part of her sentence included a forfeiture of $12 million, which is about how much money she made from selling OneTaste back in 2017. So meanwhile, you talk about comebacks and rise and fall. It's been really interesting to watch the company's response to a lot of this, which has been an increased sense of defiance. Like they have really continued to argue in the lead up to the trial, after the conviction, after the sentencing, that this is a unfair prosecution targeted at women in power. They would call it a witch hunt. They have, especially since Trump was reelected, they have actually gone after pretty right leaning media outlets to try to spin the prosecution as a threat to religious freedom. And in the most recent update, Alan Dershowitz has said publicly that he will make a case to Trump to ask for a pardon for Nicole and
Hmm.
Rachel. So they are definitely going for the pardon route. And yeah, it's just unlikely bedfellows. Like I don't think Nicole like
If you had
10
told
or
us
15
15
years
years
would
ago
have,
that
yeah.
that's,
Nope.
yeah,
I think they would have been
yeah,
very surprised. But uh, that is their current strategy, and they have continued to maintain that. Yeah, they believe that the entire um, prosecution and that the weeks long criminal trial in front of a jury of their peers who had never heard of OneTaste before, um, and that was unfair, and that their day in court, doesn't is was like rigged in some way. And so it's just been interesting to see that, yeah, in this, I think, kind of in the Trump era, like it's become much more the norm to not acknowledge wrongdoing, and to instead say, no, we maintain that nothing was wrong. And even at the sentencing, the judge did say that she made a specific note in the sentencing of Nicole and what she saw as a lack of remorse from Nicole and Rachel, and so that was her reading of the situation as well. And what will happen next, we don't know. Could they
hmm.
get pardoned? It's possible, and we'll see.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Going broad to the future of work, just as we kind of wrap to a close, uh, any, I don't know, lessons learned as a journalist? What are you going to keep track of, whether current companies or companies in the future, when you see charismatic leaders? And it seems like so many founders of startups strive to be charismatic leaders, leading movements, leading religions, not tech companies or wellness companies. Having broken stories that resulted in very big changes in the world, what are you going to keep track of next? What are you going to keep your eye on to discover future organizations like WeWork or OneTaste or any organization that is both an interesting story, a fascinating story that is complicated, but also that may uh, be a bubble or a Ponzi scheme or harm the people who are within it.
Yeah. The first example that comes to mind is not a perfect fit, but it is where I am curious about cult dynamics showing up in our lives. Like I am really interested in emotional relationships that people are having with chatbots, and I
Mm,
think that I had written a story about this with a colleague recently about people who kind of fall into delusional spirals when they are chatting a lot with ChatGPT and other chatbots. What interests me there is that cult dynamics are showing up, but in this totally unexpected way, where it's like, oh, you, there's not a human is not the charismatic leader, but there is this charismatic entity that is telling you that you have made a huge discovery, that you are on a mission, that you are part of a special group, sometimes just a group of two. One of the researchers I talked to called chatbots a cult of two. This idea that you are now following the call of this entity that is, specifically targeted toward you, telling you that you've made, in some cases, like a major scientific discovery, or discovered that the chatbot is sentient, or discovered how to tap into spiritual beings through the chatbot. It looks like a bunch of different uh, costumes depending on what interests you have. But it results in often the same thing: people getting isolated and separated from their previous relationships, people only trusting information that comes from the chatbot rather than from the outside world. This is just, one specific example, but I think yeah, that's like a charismatic entity that I want to track and pay attention to and see how it affects people. Because the other thing that's happening is it happens at scale, and it's just a really different way of thinking about cult dynamics. But I see so many parallels that I find it a really worthy direction of inquiry. But in general, yeah, it's startup founders are a fascinating topic to cover, and I think anyone who is reporting about tech now has for the last 15 years had the opportunity to do a lot of important accountability reporting, because these companies have so much money, influence, power. It goes beyond, they're much more powerful than heads of state. If you are at the head of one of these companies, it's on a whole other level. And so I think that I'm so often inspired by the reporting of my fellow journalists as we try to make sense of accumulation of money and power in the hands of just a few people.
Yeah. And for better or for worse, I don't think we've seen anything yet. I think it's only going to continue to increase over the next few years. Mm-hmm. Ellen Huet, amazing. Thank you for taking this time. Folks should go read or listen to Empire of Orgasm. It's incredible. Yeah. Thank you for the work that you do. The book is beautiful.
There's a lot in the book that is both topical but then kind of specific to this wild story. So.
Yeah. And really compelling, right? Not just interesting information, but the way you go about telling the story is absolutely captivating. Other than the book, where can folks go to learn more about you and your work?
You can probably find me pretty easily on Instagram. My website is ellenhuet.com. You'll find me.
Great. Perfect. All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Listening to this interview with Ellen Huet. One quick thing before you go, and that is the Snafu newsletter. If you have not already, I'd invite you to subscribe. It's free. It comes out every weekend. An article about influence and persuasion in our modern world of work, and a couple of things that I've loved from throughout the week. You can subscribe at robinpzander.com. And until next time, thanks for tuning in.